Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Gnome Soup. My name is Joseph Schellenberger, and today we'll be covering Thi Nguyen's Agency as Art. Some of us read the book entirely, but some of us opted to read certain portions of it. But Will and Eric, you guys read it. Will was just continuing on a point. We had a little bit of an audio issue, but we'll get right back into it here. Real quick, why don't we go ahead and go around the table, say our names again, and we'll get back into the conversation.
I'm Henry.
I'm Eric. I've read the book in its entirety.
I'm Nick, and I only read part 1.
I'm William, and I have read the Bible.
I'm Lux, and I didn't read the book, but I've taken 3 of T's classes, so hopefully I can find some connections.
Okay, and Will, why don't you go ahead and continue from your point? It was something about the practical experience of striving play or something? Or continue? I'm sorry.
Just continue. Okay, so one important thing to keep in mind about this work as a whole is that he's talking about a subset of games, the Suitzian game, and that's where all of his points are about. And Suitzian games are where you act to achieve a goal under unnecessary obstacles. That's like the portable version. So if you say like, well, here's a game that isn't that, well, fine. He's not talking about what games are. He's talking about what Suitzian games are and like the consequences of that.
Yeah, and I think to a general methodological point, he's trying to avoid the messy conversations, right? He doesn't want to have to define aesthetics for 150 pages just for someone to disagree with him anyways. There seems to be an aesthetic part of the games, and that's what he wants to get to. So he's just going to say, there might be these types of objections, but this seems to be a thing. This is what I want to talk about.
Yeah, this gets into, he goes out of his way not to define things like, he goes out of his way not to define words like agency, because that could introduce disagreements. So he just throughout it uses this language. He introduces new lingo every so often, and then uses it in a way that's fairly clear. And with Suitzian games, there's a type of playing of Sootsian games. He calls it aesthetic striving play. So in this case, this is where the beauty of games comes from. This is where the art of games come from, is this aesthetically pleasing striving against these, as Will said, unnecessary obstacles.
Yeah, and I think he takes it as a largely social focus, right? I think he doesn't include single-player games at all, just to bring that point back in. And I think there is a lot of strength to that, but it brings up an interesting angle to take up a disagreement with.
Henry is factually incorrect. He brings up a lot of single-player games.
But he doesn't really, seriously do it. He makes a point of saying, well, we won't focus on single-player games, as if he brought up single-player games when he kind of didn't. So when I was reading the book, I was like, oh, well, is Super Mario Bros., is that a Sootsian game? Is that a game where you do aesthetic striving? Is Sudoku a game where you do aesthetic striving? He totally avoids games. He basically totally avoids games like that. And so if you're coming into games agency as art with the perspective like, are games art? Are video games art? Is Sudoku or Solitaire, are those art? You won't have your question answered here in Nguyen's book.
I mean, while Will is correct, Nguyen does mention a couple of single-player games like Dream Quest. He doesn't focus on them at all, like Eric said. He just focuses on party games and then sports, board games. He seems like a really board games fan. But I think a big part of what games are is just the single-player experiences, and he just doesn't treat them with the relevance I think they deserve.
Yes, Nguyen is a board game guy. He's a tabletop game player. He's a social gamer. He has hidden in this book, I feel, is this sense of practicality. When we talk about games, we need to have a focus on frivolity, fun, and that's what single player games are all about. And it seems like for him, there's just this practicality of like, oh, well, what's a game for? I'm hanging out with my wife. I'm hanging out with my friends. I'm being directed to behave a certain way by a godlike game designer who is given, when I step in their magic circle and they're given authority over me. And this view of games might appeal to somebody who doesn't like games or is interested in like controlling human behavior, but it doesn't capture the point of games, which seems to be frivolity.
And that was the point that you had issue with, Eric, was that it seems like Nguyen, he's trying to avoid, or he does avoid like these big questions about like what agency is and all of those big discussions to try to get to like what he wants out of it, right? He's trying to get to the result, and that seems to influence everything else that he says about games.
Yes, Nguyen is a philosopher, and so he knows that he can use, he knows that philosophers are reading his books, so he knows he can use weird language and terms and technical jargon, and people will understand what he means because they're philosophers, and understanding what what is meant in a text is part of what philosophers do. So he doesn't define a whole lot, or if he does, he kind of says, "Oh well, this definition is portable. It's you'll see what I mean when I use this term later in the book." He goes out of his way not to define agency. Maybe if I already said that, I might have already said that, but that's an interesting part of this book. If you come into this wanting something on the philosophy of mind or psychology, you won't get it, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing because that means he doesn't waste his time on those topics. He can just talk about games.
Well, I think one of my big critiques against this. Kind of like, games are social for Nguyen, and maybe he ignores single-player games, right? And maybe that leaves out a part of what games could be. But I guess a big part of my disbelief for what he's trying to get at with games is that, they allow people to hop in and out of different agencies, whatever way we do it, whether it's through like narrowing down our values into this single set of values that a game gives to us and such. I guess my biggest point of disbelief is that this ability to do that will kind of like retroactively allow people in society to learn to like relate with each other. I think that's like a big point of what he's trying to do, is he's trying to say that games can allow people to like develop a habit of being able to trust each other. But I'm not sure, I just don't know if I believe that.
So that's actually a major theme of like Anglo analytic philosophy, is this idea that understanding is empathy. So you get into Thomas Hobbes, you get into Wittgenstein. They have this empathy. Teaching empathy is such a fundamental theme of these works, and I guess as Joey's saying that's a theme of Nguyen's work, and that wouldn't be surprising if that were true. Hobbes has this thing of like, how do I? He has this thing of these natural laws that are basically these rules that we follow to keep the peace, and someone might object and say, well, how do we know if we're following these rules, or how do we always follow these rules? And Hobbes' answer is like, well, imagine yourself in the position of the other person, and that's empathy. And he has a further thing of like. It's all in the elements of law. Wittgenstein also has a thing of knowing the meaning of a word is like empathizing with a person who's using the word, because he has this thing of like, well, in practice, the meaning of a word is its use. It's all very interesting, but people nowadays, they talk about like, well, we could avoid all these problems if we could teach empathy, and I think that's one of the main purposes of philosophy. And it's interesting if Nguyen is using this idea of like, well, we can use games to teach empathy.
So I do have a question for you guys who did read the book, and this might seem like an arbitrary distinction, but I think that when we're talking about magic circles and when we're talking about empathy, it might be important. And I'm wondering, does Thi talk about a distinction between these very close together, like tabletop games where you can physically interact with people, versus social games that are more anonymous? So I'm thinking like huge Minecraft servers where you're not really talking to people, but you still know there's someone on the other end. Is there a difference that he outlines, and would this have a difference in what Thi says is like we step into the magic circle?
Yeah, if I could just interject real quick. I guess that is my question for you guys is like, say he doesn't address single player games, what's the big consequence? What is Thi leaving out that like single player games seems to present?
Thi's main examples are tabletop games like Root, and he also uses these examples of these art games where everyone's interacting with each other. I think doesn't he have that example? Will, doesn't he have that? Isn't one of his examples like Werewolf or something? It's a game where it's like just a bunch of people and we don't know who the werewolf is or something. So I think that would be kind of a game, and like that would be the kind of like social game that Lux is talking about.
Yeah. I do know he specifically brings up Spyfall, where there's a spy and then there's a bunch of other people and they want to figure out who the spy is. But they also, while trying to figure out who the spy is, they can't tell the location of where they are, because for some reason that makes them lose if the spy figures out where they are. So, and the spy just got a bullshit pretending that he knows where they are when he does not.
I mean, he does mention Minecraft, I think, once or twice in the book, and he mentions Minecraft in the context of social coordination, that maybe game developers are creating these spaces that aren't physical, like with tabletop and board games, but these virtual spaces in which people can still communicate and cooperate in the game. He doesn't go too much in depth into that, he just mentions Minecraft as an example of that.
Yeah, I guess this might be to try to motivate why he sticks to the social games, why he sticks to those sorts of things, is that in the background of a lot of aesthetics, there's discussions about empathy, there's discussions about, like, actually can you get different perspectives from art? And so I think what's compelling about games is because it has that special, you're kind of changing your epistemic value suddenly, right? And so it seems like that's getting somewhere close to a different perspective, and it seems to be entertaining, that idea. And I think that's the heart of what he's trying to get at. And I think it is very much motivated. I think there was a point earlier about whether he's trying to do kind of a social conditioning thing, maybe, building empathy. I think that is in the background. I think that is motivating it.
I might be kind of digging us into a rabbit hole here, but I don't know. I just feel like there's almost all games, even what we would say is not social games, are social in some aspects. You can think of like, I'm doing a Sudoku puzzle. I could go get help from someone. I could participate in a contest. There are communities that build around these non-social games, such as speedrunning communities for Mario. Does that have any type? Does he talk about that at all?
He talks quite a bit about, if there are communities. I think in particular, the Magic the Gathering. Like in Magic the Gathering, you follow a meta. And the meta is always changing, and there's this big community built up around what's the new meta, and even the game designers are involved. So I think he does talk about that, because I think in the lingo of games lingo that's going around, that's referred to as a meta. This way of understanding the game that makes you really good at it.
So on a different point, one big thing he brings up with the ability to games is to invert the value of means and ends. Generally what happens is you have means, which are worthless, and then you have ends, which are valuable. And then with games, you reverse that direction, and the means become valuable, and the ends become worthless.
Now, come on, Will. The means are not necessarily worthless. The means can be ends in themselves as well. We can have... I can give an example of what one says is a maieutic end in the philosophy of practical... In the philosophy of practical reasoning, we know those sorts of ends as second-order ends. Essentially, they are ends, we assume, that birth other ends, and ends that are disposable once we achieve those ends. So I'm going to give the example that David Schmitz gives, the example of a college student who doesn't know what career they want, and they have the end of choosing a good career. But when they choose a good career, say surgeon or doctor, then they already fulfilled the end of searching for a good career. They already have the career, but now they have the end of becoming a good doctor, becoming a good surgeon. So that can be an example of means not being completely worthless.
Yeah. So if you want to read this book, the notion of disposable ends is a big deal, because he has this whole thing of like temporary agencies and disposable ends, where an agency in a game is something you take up, and those ends, you have them and you pursue them sincerely and you strive towards them, but they are just disposable. These ends are temporary and disposable, and you abandon them when outside of the game. That's his whole theory of agency here is you can take up an agency, and that agency comes with challenges and ends, and then when you're done with the game, and that's engaging in the game, and when you're done with the game, you abandon them.
So a lot of games will have stuff like victory points, and while you're playing the game, I have a few examples. One would be Wonder 7 Duel. You get victory points throughout the games by buying certain blue cards, and you're gonna be really trying to get those and screwing over the other person so that they can't get the blue cards because you want those blue cards, they're mine. And then you at the end of the game you count up the blue cards, you see your ones, and then the blue cards you don't give a shit about them, you just chuck them in a box because we're not playing the game anymore, they're worthless.
Yeah, with that kind of the sudden shift, it's typically they're an interesting part about games is that if you were to remain competitive afterwards, at least at the same level of competitive, there might be a bit of bitterness, but if you're at the same level of competitive, it's bizarre. It feels like you're not really understanding what happened, right?
Yeah, you're taking it too seriously. Just to get something Will said earlier is that means are worthless. And this is a problem for Joey. He's gonna have to edit me saying this, me talking about this next to Will talking about this. In philosophy we talk about teleology. It's like the philosophy. It's the perspective of like the ends are what matters. That's what teleology is. So this idea of like, well, means are useless and everything's about ends. That's what philosophers refer to as teleology. And then Nick looks like he's going to talk.
Yeah, so the thing is, when we're saying that the means in the game are worthless and that maybe we're taking the game too seriously, that's from the perspective of the self outside the game. I think it makes complete sense for the self inside the game to believe that the means can have value and that you cannot take the game too seriously because you're freaking in the game. That's your world right now.
This gets back into the disposable temporary ends thing, like what Henry and Nick are talking about. Thi has this whole thing. It makes intuitive common sense to say don't take a game too seriously. Don't bring it into real life. And that's what Thi is saying is like, when he's going on about disposable ends and temporary agencies and inner agencies and nested agencies, he's all being a philosopher about it and using all this jargon, but he's just talking about like the good common sense of don't take it into real life. And that's one upside of the book, or maybe a downside depending on your perspective, is that he's being all philosopher-y about it, but what he's saying is when he's talking about disposable agency makes good sense.
Well, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you guys, I brought this up in the Discord too, but at least for me personally, when a large part of game playing for me is to try to figure out how to, I guess you might say, cheat the game or find out the optimum way to to win the game. And then when you come back to the game, it's kind of like this back and forth between the player and the creator of the game. It's where you defeat the game by finding a way that's like totally going to OP the way you play the game. And so the game's like, oh no, when I come back to it the next time, it's going to be boring. And I can't really get into it because now I know the optimum way to do it. So for me, if there isn't always kind of like this, there's always kind of like this push and motivation to defeat the game. And so it isn't really this pretending to want to win. It really is like winning the game. And then when I come back to it the next time, the game has like pushed more obstacles in the way in order to like disqualify the method that I used to defeat it in the first place. So it's like a fresh new challenge. It's a new environment and everything.
So what Joey's talking about is, a sincere desire to beat the game, to overcome the challenges. This is what Nguyen refers to as striving play, and he talks in the book about evolving metas and how the game changes. And this is where the yelling will start on this episode, because what Joey said there is he said there's an interaction between the player and the designer. That's not necessarily true, and that's the fundamental flaw of this book, is that Nguyen is only talking about when that's true, but then he pretends that he's talking about games in a wider sense, like all Seussian games. He has this assumption that the designer is controlling the player. And that's wrong. The aesthetics driving play is not on the designer. The designer might have made a good game, and they might have played a good role, but the aesthetics driving play is due to the striver, who is the player.
I'm going to try to connect Joey's and Eric's points. So, Joey, I think you're asking for something that's impossible in the single-player game sphere, but one thing that's happening right now in the multiplayer games, because what you want is a game that's constantly updating so that it can increase the challenges as you get better in the game. But what happens with single-player games is that there is a set challenge that's never evolving, and you either master it or you abandon it at some point. But when it comes to multiplayer games, people are finding new strategies every day and new ways to defeat each other. And when it comes to Eric's point, I'm going to disagree. I think that while the game developers are not responsible for the aesthetics driving play, they are not, like you said, controlling the player, but they are setting the constraints to which the player is voluntarily submitting themselves.
All right, so before we get into the interactions between players and developers, I did want to connect Joey's point to something that T said in the class that Henry and I have together. This, and something that also brings in Nicholas's point of the difference between autotelic and technical activities. And I think, Nick, what you said actually...
Just for clarification, what do those terms mean exactly?
Yeah, okay. So technical activity is something that is meant to eliminate itself. So think about medicine as a study is meant to ultimately eliminate diseases. And so then it would eliminate the study of medicine versus...
Yeah, that's what it's about.
Or autotelic activities. Well, theoretically, that's what it's about. Autotelic activities are something that is meant to perpetuate itself, to keep going, and that's what T in our class at least said are games, and I quoted him, games are the meaning of life. But I think what Nick said was really interesting in that maybe single-player games are more like technical activities in which you can master them and ultimately get rid of the fun or the challenge of playing that game, versus maybe a social game would be more of an autotelic game. Although I don't know if it comes to like a stopping point at all. Yeah, Will.
Okay, so social games can, I think single player games and social games actually have the same problem. So like in a single player game, as an example of something where like you can keep doing better, scores. Get the highest score. And like, if you get a higher score, you're better. And like, like as the score gets up, the difficulty of the game is going to be a lot harder to get a higher score. And then eventually you're going to find out you got the highest score you can possibly get, and then the game's over. Now you say, well, that's also a feature of social games, because with social games, once you get to the point where you're playing it as well as you can, to where like, it's like tic-tac-toe is an example of a game. It's like such a game. There's a min-max algorithm that determines like the best move to make in every single situation, and tic-tac-toe is a social game. So the game's now worthless because, we know exactly what to do.
But I'm thinking more about multiplayer video games in which there isn't a set strategy to always win the game. It's more of an evolving thing that the players develop by themselves.
Like I said, it's basically same problem / not problem. So like, high score games as well. You'll have a bunch of strategies and you'll develop new strategies yourself to get higher scores, stuff that the developer wasn't really thinking about. And that sort of thing happens with multiplayer games. It's just, I think with like multiplayer games, why it often is easier to get a situation where the challenge is ever evolving is because, a better player will just come up to, defeat you. Whereas like, so there's like two adversaries. Whereas when there's just like, when it's a single player game, it's just the person made it. Oh, I guess like your adversary is responding to you. Whereas with single player games, your adversary is not responding to you.
Yeah, I mean, the idea I have is that in single player games, the adversary is the developer, but the developer is never changing. It's just a static challenge. In multiplayer games, it's going to be something more dynamic.
Well, this is an idea I had about this, was perhaps like the design of the game, the designer of the game has made it so that the environment of the game, all of the rules and everything, there are just like so many variables and permutations from just like chess, right? There's like who knows how many moves, but chess engines are still finding more and more efficient ways to respond to action and such. So it could be that for my idea of like a game that's supposed to be constantly evolving, for these games such as like Go or chess, these single player games, maybe Sudoku, maybe it's not applicable in that case, but perhaps there's just like so many variables that you have yet to get to stage 2 of overcoming the game, and so the game needs to evolve to account for that.
Nick Will and Joey are talking about, well, Joey brought it up a game like chess. And chess is a good example of a game that is great and everyone loves it, and you can do aesthetic striving play because you can do aesthetic striving play in chess, everyone loves it. But chess is a good example of where the designers don't deserve any credit in the game.
I think they deserve some credit.
No.
They made the game possible.
No. Well, sure, they did something at some point in time, but they don't create aesthetic striving play. You, the chess player, creates the aesthetic striving play. So Nick brings up, like, well, what if the game designer is involved with the meta? What if they're involved? They're changing the challenges up, and it's like, yeah, in that case they deserve credit. But if the game designer is like the creative basketball or the creative chess, they don't deserve any credit because they're not doing anything. They don't deserve. I should specify, they don't deserve credit in your game. When you play basketball, when you play chess, the makers of chess are not telling you what to do. They're not directing you. They don't deserve any credit. I mean, sure, they made pretty pieces. They made pretty officer pieces. They made lovely little pawns, but it's you're the one who's doing the striving with the pawns and the officers, not them. They're not involved at all. They don't deserve any credit. They basically don't exist. Like, chess could have been created out of nothing, and in that case, and it might as well have been because nobody knows who created chess anyway.
So I guess what I'm thinking is, are you saying that like his scope is off or something? Like, basically there's some games where the designer is responsible when the environment is highly restrained, then the designer is responsible for striving play. But in those more open environments, such as like basketball and chess, the designer isn't responsible for the aesthetic striving of the player.
I would say that it's not so much a distinction between open and constrained as it is a distinction of involvement of the designer versus non-involvement. So in the cases where the designer is not involved, they are not producing aesthetic striving play, and so they don't deserve any credit for aesthetic striving play. The player deserves all the credit. So I mean, there are cases where in like your examples of like constrained play, the constraint there is a constraint that the designer is putting on directly. So when I was a child, I didn't like tabletop gaming because I saw it as constrained. But tabletop games, like if you're playing Agricola, Uwe Rosenberg, who's the designer of that game, is not involved. He doesn't deserve any credit for your ability to collect all the reeds, and collecting all the reeds might be considered aesthetic striving play. But Uwe Rosenberg is not involved. He doesn't deserve any credit. But yes, in tabletop, it's more constrained than in basketball. But the constraint isn't what makes the difference. The designer's direct involvement is what makes the difference.
So what I get from you, Eric, is saying that like the game, the rules, everything that like structures the environment that the player is set in, the agent is set in. The environment is not like an agent. It's just like dead. It's just like the given, right? I know that we were talking over Discord about this as well. It's like I was saying how there are like it grants a lot of things that, I don't know, it typically aren't granted agency. And so is this like, would you probably say that the game designer doesn't deserve like any credit for the aesthetic experience because, well, there's no agent involved there. It's just like rules, right?
Yeah, from what I'm gathering, it's kind of, you're saying that because the aesthetic striving play requires the obstacles in order to like be aesthetic striving play, that the credit should be the people who are engaging in your obstacles, right? In chess, the play is coming from the other person setting the obstacles and you overcoming the other person. And the game designer isn't, and I guess this is where like maybe the disagreement would be, is like whether the creation of theoretical obstacle creation is like worthy of credit or whatever.
The short answer is yes. The long answer is, in games, in aesthetic striving play, you're talking about doing something, and people deserve credit for what they do. Uwe Rosenberg, the creators of basketball, the creators of chess, when you play Agricola, when you play basketball, when you play chess, they're not doing anything. They might as well, they could, they're not doing anything. You're doing all the things. So you deserve the credit. You're doing the striving, so you get credit for the aesthetic striving. And then I'll finish up real quick. And then in Henry's case, it's like, oh, well, the obstacles, or actually I wanted to talk about what Joey was saying. It's like, well, the obstacles and the rules, they're the givens. And yeah, that's a good point. They're the givens. Wittgenstein has this whole thing about like chess, like rules of chess. Are the rules of chess acting at a distance? And the answer is the answer that he gives, and this is in the Blue Book, is no. They're not acting at a distance. They're acting locally. But who are they acting in? They're acting in the player. The designer who made the rule book is not acting at a distance.
Well, sorry, Will. Let me just say this real quick. I guess the reason why a person could say that like the environment has agency, isn't involved in the aesthetic experience, is because rules aren't just like this. Somebody could say that rules, the environment, is not just this passive thing and like a dead obstacle, and it's actually something that like actively pushes against like somebody's actions when they're playing inside of a game. And so in that way, if you think of like rules as something like pushing back on what you're allowed to do with inside of a given space, then I guess somebody could grant agency to that environment.
Okay, so I'm trying to get to, so like the problem is whether or not the designer is involved determines whether they're responsible for the aesthetic agency.
That's the issue. Is that if the designer wants credit, they have to be involved. The player is involved by definition.
So I would kind of have Shakespeare made plays that people perform.
Yep.
He's dead. He can't be involved in those, so he wouldn't take credit according to this.
Well, giving, you can think of, Shakespeare doesn't deserve credit for the aesthetic acting of the actors, but he deserves credit for the script, he deserves credit for the text. Uwe Rosenberg deserves credit for making a nice board game. Agricola is a great board game, my favorite. It's a nice board game. He deserves credit. It's cool. But when I play it, I don't have to, say props to him for me playing this game well, and neither do, like, Shakespearean actors, even though we call them Shakespearean, they are great regardless of Shakespeare. So if they're doing if they're acting Streetcar Named Desire, Joseph's Technicolor Dreamcoat, they're great. They can be great there. They can be great independently of Shakespeare. They can be great independently of the playwright. And we do associate a Shakespearean actor with Shakespeare, but their acting is independent of Shakespeare, and they're the ones who get the credit.
All right, I'm thinking in regards to this, there would be there is actually an example he brings up, which is like a dodgeball, and he says that dodgeball sucks. Because basically with dodgeball, what ends up happening is, just a bunch of weenie kids end up having a bunch of balls chucked at them by bigger kids, and like it's no fun for the weenie kid. And he's like, well, like, if someone designed a different game like basketball, like if we were playing basketball, we wouldn't have people getting chucked by balls, chucked balls at. So, the game has some obvious effect on the actions that people take and what they're doing. And so I would say that the game designer would be somewhat responsible for what they're doing. Because, like, if they weren't playing that game, they'd be doing something else.
So here is something that may support Eric's position, and you guys let me know what you think. So Lux explained a difference Nguyen makes between autotelic and technical games. What happens with technical games, which we may assume are just single-player games, you play it and the fun runs out, the challenge, you conquer all the challenges. What's going to happen then, what sometimes happens is that, imagine you're playing Dark Souls or something like that, and you are going through all the new game pluses, but the challenge isn't really there anymore. But people still want to play Dark Souls. They really, really like this game. So they're going to go with no death runs, no hit runs. I know of a guy who did a either a no hit or a no death run throughout all the Dark Souls games. So if he died once in any of them, he had to go back to the first one. So what's going to happen is that the game developers didn't intend that. They couldn't have foreseen that, at least not in the first games. So, and I think that's just beautiful. When someone achieves that ridiculous challenge, I say, wow, they really did something amazing here, at least within the constraints of the game.
Okay, I'm just gonna go. So Will brings up choosing. Nick and Will both bring up the choosing to strive, choosing the game. The player does that. The designer, Uwe Rosenberg, doesn't care if I play Agricola. The creators of basketball don't care if I play basketball. I care about it. And so I do the choosing, and that's like that first endeavor that gets me on the path of aesthetic striving. But all that aesthetic striving, the way I play, what I play, it's all my choice. And so I get the credit.
Okay, so I was going to go, so for Nick's point about mods, I would point that as something that the designer does not get credit for. And I would agree, because they're not playing the game anymore. They're doing something else now. So I don't think that really troubles Nguyen's point, really. The other thing about people choosing to do those things, I mean, the fact that people are choosing to do it, I don't really see how that would make it so that they're not responsible. People choose to read books or look at art and stuff like that. And so we're still going to give credit to the writer and the painter, even if they didn't force you to do those things.
Well, it's like if I'm moving towards something, it's like you could say, well, I'm moving towards a goal, like physically in space. I'm moving in a direction. One could say, well, God created that direction, so you should give God credit for your moving towards in that direction. But it's like, no, but I get to choose the direction, and I'm the one who moves in the direction. And this gets into that whole problem that Thi is going for, where he thinks that the developer, the game designer, is like this godlike being who sets the player's events in motion. Basically, it's the godlike being that creates the direction and pushes the player is nothing more than a ball on an inclined plane, and the designer makes the inclined plane. The designer puts the ball on the top of the inclined plane, and it's just a matter of gravity to move the player down the inclined plane. But in games, it's all about frivolity. You're not just a ball that gets placed on the top of an inclined plane. You get to make a choice. You get to make a choice where to go, what direction to move in. And this is the main issue that with Thi's work, is he doesn't acknowledge this.
Yeah, so on both Will's and Eric's points about choosing to play a game, I feel like there's a difference between choosing to play a game because you find it fun versus maybe choosing to play a game ironically, and that might be possibly part of the developer's choice. So I'm thinking about Pathologic, if any of you have heard that, a game designed in my mind specifically to be really not fun for the player, and people play it because I don't know, they're just masochists and they don't want to have fun. But is that something that the developers have some part in playing, like whether they want to make a game that people are choosing to play for this reason or they're choosing to play it for a different reason?
Okay, so maybe what Eric's going for, because he did bring this up with the actors, is that the game designer is responsible for something, but he's not responsible for the player's actions. Maybe it's something of that accord, but I'm not exactly sure, what is... I guess you'd be responsible for the type of agency you can perform within that space. But, the designer would be responsible for the potential, but he's not really responsible for what people actually do within that space.
I mean, well, Will brought up potential. This gets into like Aristotelianism, where it's like you have act and potency, and it's like, oh, you can think about it like, oh, well, the designer is what makes the potency, and then the player is what makes the act, of playing a game. I guess maybe if you look at it that way, there's more room to give the designer credit. Although, I think that when has this thing of like, oh, the designer and the player are cooperating. And that is what I'm objecting to, because that may be true in some cases, but that is not true of all games or true necessarily. Like my example of Agricola. It would be cool if Uwe Rosenberg was like guiding me during play, but he's not. He doesn't have to, so I get all the credit and he doesn't have to do anything, and I can just appreciate the game as like an artifact. Like going back to like the rules of chess. The rules of chess aren't doing any directing for me. I just know them, and I can actualize a game of chess. The potency is there, like Thomas Aquinas has this example, speaking of an Aristotelian, he has this example of like the understanding and the intellect. The intellect is the potency, understanding something. When you understand anything, the understanding is the act, the intellect is the potency. So you can think about it like the player is the one understanding the game, the designer is the intellect that came up with the game. But if you don't understand something, your intellect doesn't deserve any credit. But it's when you understand something, then your intellect deserves credit. So when a player plays a game, they understand the game, then the understanding deserves the credit. The intellect that came up with the game doesn't deserve the credit.
This might be a weird point, but I just want to kind of see what you think about it. So just to give like a bit of context, when Death of the Author was becoming a big thing, there was this one English professor, Harold Bloom, and he came up with this objection where he thought that, the author is always there when you're reading it, but not the literal author, but more of like your own psychologically constructed version of it. So maybe it is when we engage with these games, we are always engaging, not with the actual game designer themselves, but like our kind of weird cognitively created copy of them.
Yeah, like the like this, the author is at a distance, and the local author that you're engaging with is just your imagined version. But then that's on the player as well. That's on the reader as well. When you're talking about the dead author that you're imagining, that's on the reader. So it's all on the reader, and just like with games, it's all on the player.
Okay, there's another important point which kind of gets rid of part of what I was saying. So in games, there's always going to be a goal in mind, and then there's going to be obstacles. Basically, I think what would happen is that if it's a good game, then getting from the obstacle to the goal is going to end up like being this great sequence of actions, and there's going to be multiple possible ways to get there. And then basically I think the better a game is, the higher the chance that someone playing the game is going to choose a path through it that is pleasing. And the worse the game is, the more likely they are going to choose a path that is unpleasing. So like in dodgeball, there's multiple different possibilities, but because the goal is to hit people with balls, you're going to end up having like one dude who's like a bunch of people chucking a bunch of balls at, and that sucks.
Well, if I just to your point there, something that you said, the point of I'm sorry if this may actually kind of derail where we're going, kind of, but when you said the purpose of dodgeball is to chuck balls at the the fourth graders, right, and knock them off their feet, but I don't think that people can have so many goals when coming to a game. Like, do you play dodgeball? You're hitting the person, but the goal of dodgeball is to feel power over dodging and throw, and I don't know. It's is sometimes goals can be for this dodgeball example. It may not necessarily be throwing the ball at the person, but maybe amassing this feeling of I don't know, splendor as you're playing the game. I know it's like it's an action you have to perform inside of the game, but I guess this is one of my critiques against the idea that a game is at its core like practical action, is that there are so many ways in which a person can approach a game. It's like, well, which core is this game like claiming is the core like a purpose? I don't know. That's one of my big critiques.
Oh yes, Will's trying to get us back on track for the book because he's bringing up Dodgeball is Nguyen's favorite, or at least one of the examples he gives of like a bad game. You know, it's not all it because in Dodgeball you're just throwing stuff at people. You know, there's not necessarily any room for aesthetics driving, which is how you make a beautiful game.
I'm not sure I agree,
but Joey doesn't agree. I mean, I associate Dodgeball with like there's that funny movie and like those red balls and like it's all fun to be like jumping around, dodging and weaving. But this gets back into why I think what I do. Sure, like someone can play a game of Dodgeball real good, but that's on them. The creators of Dodgeball just thought, oh, wouldn't it be funny if we had a bunch of kids throw red rubber balls at each other? Wouldn't that be funny? And like, they don't deserve any. This is why they don't deserve any credit for that. Even more so than say Uwe Rosenberg or the creator of Basketball. The creators of Dodgeball just wanted to create something silly and stupid, and you can have people who are pretty athletic, people who can dodge a wrench and they can dodge a ball, you can have great players, and therefore Dodgeball can be beautiful, but it's not on the designer, and the designer is what makes a game good or bad. The player is what makes the striving play aesthetic or not. But we're talking about two different orders, two different types of artifacts,
My time now.
Yeah, his time.
I'm moving to something else. Anyway, there's two other things. One is we can do value capture, or we can go back to the inversion between means being valuable and ends being valuable and means being worthless versus.
Isn't that just a normal valuation? I think the inversion would be the ends being worthless and the means being the reason why we do things.
No, what? No. Like, generally, like you do things so that you can get something.
Yeah, that's the common traditional valuation. The inversion would be the ends are worthless and the means are the reason why we do it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Those are the two. So value capture or that thing or something else. And where do you guys want to go? Because I think we're getting stuck on this topic.
We can, I think looking at the kind of uniqueness of the value change might be an interesting place to go. We already kind of introduced it a bit. And it kind of reminds me, it was kind of brought up in one of the classes. He calls it a playfulness, which is an interesting way to do it. But that, this might just be a weird point to bring up, but he thinks that to get out of certain epistemic traps, right, like echo chambers and stuff like that, what you have to do is treat knowledge sometimes as a game, right? Something where you're just you're doing it for the sake of learning new things, not for any value except to just learn new things, right? And so I think, I don't know, it's a bit weird because it's like there does feel like there has to be parts of our life. You have to have that dividing line. I think he brings that up in the conclusion to the book as well. But it's kind of seeing the uniqueness of games and maybe trying to put that in recontextualize it once we have this framework in ways of completely different fields.
Oh, yeah. So one thing is that this type of thing kind of is a bit different than how a lot of people, philosophers used to think. So basically what would happen is you have something like the end, such as let's say pleasure. That's all that matters, always. And then you also have that kind of possibility with Kant, categorical comparative. That's all that matters, always. Whereas with games, we're actually able to change what matters. Values can actually change over time, rather than values just being this constant thing.
Well, one of the things I'm kind of questioning here is whether or not I know and appreciate what T is trying to do by saying, agents can switch their values back and forth and such. But are they really switching their values, or are they just switching their objects that are like given the value? I'm not going to give much value to, I don't know, becoming like the number one stockholder in this company. I'm going to switch my attention to gathering all of these tokens and seeing how many I can get. I don't know, like, have your values disappeared, or have they just been transferred to another object of attention?
I think T's idea is we don't worry about where we worry about our values, like, by definition, the values that we have in real life, but we don't necessarily carry anything into or out of a game. So in the example of the guy, money versus tokens, like, the tokens don't come to replace the money. And in fact, at the end of the book is him talking about, what if the tokens replace the money? What if I care about tokens as much as I care about money? And that's what he calls value capture. And so it's just easier to say we have all new values when we step into the magic circle of the game. Because some values are irreplaceable and some are disposable. So the values outside the game, irreplaceable. So you can't transmogrify them into something else in the game. Although some people who really are concerned with money might find games with tokens to be more entertaining because they can treat their tokens like money. But I think the idea is you have the values that matter and the values that don't matter. The values that don't matter and are disposable are taken up. They're all new. The values that matter are in their own space and are kept pre-game, in-game, post-game. That's the basics.
Yeah, I suppose. So, okay. I guess this is the point that I'm trying to make is kind of it expands past the points of agent versus creator and who's involved and such, and it continues along what he's trying to get at, which is the ability of agents to be fluid in their values and such. The reason why I call into doubt whether or not someone's actually changing, whether the distinguishment should be made between value change versus like object of desire change, that's kind of important because going into what T would think is the practical social element of this entire discussion of games is, somebody who's able to switch their values. Maybe they cared about a certain group before, and now, I've experienced games. I've had the practice of being able to be fluid with my values. Now I care about this group as well. To me, that seems less about about your values changing rather than the different types of people that you're including inside of your values.
To Henry, this sounds like very close to the distinction between Bailey and Nussbaum that we talked about, doesn't it? Particularly with fiction.
Yeah, I think I'd mentioned that a little bit at the start, but it's one of the background conversations is whether you can actually entertain different perspectives in art. And because I think what had happened was Nussbaum had written these books that really liked that idea and stressed the importance of narrative. And then a bunch of other people were like, well, is it actually true, right? And I think you can kind of see T's point of where he falls, right? And I think to some point, there might not be any difference beyond just kind of how you can, what intuition you can motivate more about how much your values can actually change, because obviously it can't be super dramatic, right? Mm-hmm. You can't you could never enter a game and suddenly you're killing people or something. I don't think so. So there always has to be some coaching to it, but I think maybe the argument would be...
Oh, yeah, actually, so there was a time in elementary school where we were playing a zombie game, and it did actually bite the other kids, so...
Well, sorry, Nicholas, let me just get this in real quick. To your point, Henry, about, I think T says something similar about this when he was talking about... what was his name? It was this one philosopher, Miguel Sicart, maybe? I'm not sure. But he wrote something called The Banality of Simulated Evil. And he was basically saying it's bad when games quantify morals. And in our notes, on this particular portion. I said that, quote, "This is so silly and out of touch with how people interact with games in real life." It kind of like goes back to the old, like during the 80s, during like all of these panics, right? Like video games was included in it because it's like, oh no, our kids are playing Doom. they're going to like go on a rampage and stuff. This is also one of my hesitations to accept Thi's overall goal, which is to say that like art can motivate people to do something, or if they do something, if it's truly different from, if it's truly different.
So, Joey, I was going to speak to something you already mentioned, and that's the public perception of violent games. That many people believe that if children play violent games, they're just violent themselves, or they're going to become violent. In the book, Nguyen examines different perspectives of the values and how values work in games. Two different perspectives which he thinks are wrong is that first we go into games with the same values we have in real life, and that another one would be that when we go into games, you're only constraining the values you have to a subset, and that's the values that apply in the game. And he thinks those are wrong, and he goes for what Eric said, that you step into a magic circle and suddenly you have whole new values in this game that you may not have in real life. And I think maybe that social issue is because people believe that if you're playing a violent game, you are violent yourself, instead of just being a different value that the game causes you to have.
We're talking about values. What are people meaning here? Are you talking about desires? Are those exactly the same things?
Well, if we go with how Nguyen does things, we don't really need to define values. We just understand what they are. But we can try to define them if that would be useful.
So I think the way he's using it is he's using it in like values is what you want or what you care about. So once again, we're getting back to maybe this audio got survived or didn't. We were talking earlier about how games agency as art isn't a philosophical dictionary. He just uses words, and he knows that philosophers are going to read his book and try to understand what he says, based on their ordinary language. I mean, I guess you could criticize the book on like, well, what is a value? What is an agent? What are we talking about here? What exactly are we talking about here? And I think it's his point of view is like, oh, well, you'll know. When you read the book, you'll know. But I think values is just what we care about. In this book, that's what values refers to, is what we care about. It doesn't refer to why or what caring means. It's just what we care about.
I think, Eric, when you say that, you bring up kind of something about Thi's method inside of this book, which is, he doesn't. He says that he's not going to go into a discussion of agency and such. It's because he wants to get to a certain place, right? And what he's trying to get at with games. And as such, he's being a bit of a pragmatist here, right? He's saying that these terms, they're complicated. The philosophers will take care of them, but for all intents and purposes, this is what I want to do with these set of terms, and this is what I want to come out of this project.
The strength of this book is its a notion that it advances, which is like disposable ends, disposable values, games agency as art, and then at the very end, the dangers of value capture. And those 4 points, that values can be disposable, games ends can be disposable, games are agency, and if you take it too seriously, you get value capture. Those 4 points are the strengths of this book. So what Joey was talking about was Thi wants to get to the point. He wants to emphasize the strengths rather than be pedantic, which is what another philosopher might do. But pedantry, there's no reward, because in philosophy nowadays, you're supposed to disagree with everything everyone else says. So he just wants to say, isn't this a neat way to think about it? And then the reader is supposed to go like, yeah, it is a pretty neat way to think about it. I don't see anything wrong here. I know what the word value means. I know what the word end means. I don't need to dispute this. But if he presented a definition of, say, value or agent, you'd he'd be all like, well, I don't necessarily know if I agree with that, and then it would be derailed. Although it is cool when they do in these philosophical dictionaries like Quiddities or like the Blue and the Brown Book or Elements of Law. It is nice when philosophers are like, well, this is how I'm using this word. So that would be a privilege. But nowadays, everyone disagrees with everybody else, so there's no point in doing that.
Well, and you know what? I guess on this point, while I may disagree with several aspects of what he's trying to get at, I think I do somewhat respect that, in that he's just trying to say something and just get it out there instead of being bogged down in all of, philosophizing. But I know as aspiring philosophers, we may have issues with that. But I know I kind of somewhat respect that, trying to get somewhere. But
yes, his aims are literary. His aims are philosophical and literary. A true, just a dedicated, pedantic philosopher might, want to define words, and that's good. But at the end of the day, he wants to make a book. He wants to make a book that's worth reading, and I don't think it's worth reading if you're a game designer. But if you're a philosopher, it is worth reading because he has a really neat way to think about it. Hopefully, books like Games Agency as Art will be written by philosophers who will think about the error that I mentioned, which is Thi thinks that designers are godlike beings. Hopefully, better books will be written which will build upon the work that Thi did. So it's a good work philosophically, a good work literarily. It's not a book that game designers should read because they will get the wrong idea,
I think we've pretty much covered, I don't know, maybe like the first half of the book. But like the second half kind of goes into like gamification, and it kind of like gets to the in my opinion, what he's really after for his book. Gamification, to what extent can games be used in life? Because according to Thi, they narrow down our set of values and they make things easier to do, right? They give you a better course of action. But when you bring that sort of approach to, I don't know, more complicated issues, and then that could get us into some pretty hairy situations. So what I'm kind of curious about, and this is the part that I unfortunately didn't have time to get to. So if you guys have much to say on this aspect, and how, does he try to balance it? How does this work out?
So a couple of things. They aren't really contributions, but questions to you guys, and specifically to Henry and Lux, who said that they have taken or are taking classes from Nguyen. Well, one of my questions would be, he said something to the effect of games are the meaning of life. And I was wondering to what extent gamification is really that beneficial for human life and the ways in which it can go awry, if ever.
I think I kind of mentioned it earlier with the echo chamber examples where he's talking about seeking truth. And if you're able to turn that into a game, because it's a game, right? And if you were to accept the earlier premises of the idea that the kind of the changing values, you're able to kind of take this on in a way that would allow you to approach at least sometimes truth in a way that might get you out of echo chambers, right? Because now you're like, well, what if I just entertained these ideas just for the sake of trying to entertain these ideas and not like a previous motivation that I had on them? And so I think the idea is that if you're to accept the idea that getting stuck in a certain ways of thinking is bad, and getting stuck in certain living ways is bad, then having the ability to gamify a given trait or attribute might be a way out of that.
Me. Okay, I'm gonna try to define what Henry is talking about more goodily. I think what he means is basically there's methods for obtaining truth that different people use, or methods they think this is the method you use if you want to obtain truth. And if you think of that as a game, then you're like, well, I'm playing this game right now, but what if I do this other thing? I use this method instead to achieve truth, and let's see how that goes about. I don't know. Sorry, I'm gonna stop.
All right, so to Nicholas's point, and I think I'm coming at this from a bit of a different point than Henry is. And I haven't thought about this in a while, so Joey might be able to help me out with it. But I think that T is somewhat following from Borgman, in that, do you guys know the main argument that Borgman makes specifically about things and devices?
No.
All right. So I'll try my best. I have not thought about this in like 3 years. So to Borgman, I'm going to use his primary example of a wooden stove versus a central heating system. So the stove is a thing. It's inseparable from the context of its world. It is a socially involved world in which people gather around the stove as a way to get their heat. It's a world that involves skill. Specifically, I have to go out and chop the wood in order to get my heat. Versus devices, they separate us from... So yes, we put in the work to make money, and that money goes to the central heating, but it kind of separates that skill from the commodity that we get. And it gives us a product that's disburdened from any other elements that would go into it. So we're never directly involved. And Borgman thinks, oh man, this kind of sucks. And he says that, he goes into a lot of reasons why, but his main conclusion is that a technological utopia would be absolute hell. And so how do we get out of this, especially as we're moving towards this world where we're more and more reliant on technology and we're getting less and less connected with the commodities that we have. And T and Borgman, I think, both think that games are the solution to this. In particular, they're a commodified version of the struggles that we go through. So you think of Minecraft, we're able to struggle in order to get the things that we need. In many other games, it provides us with this struggle, and it provides us with this meaning that we can still have for our lives in this world where we are wholly disburdened from everything that we have.
Yeah, that's an excellent point to bring Borgman into this because, I mean, you think of gamification, simplification of values for T and such. This is why he's always kind of obsessed with like systems. And whenever a system is present, he's like, oh, there's a simplification and such. But yeah, for Borgman, so to Nicholas's point, when T's like games are the answer, I don't know. I think I saw something in Agency as art when he was talking about something like the end of like all struggle, right? And what will be the only thing we'll have if there's no such thing as struggle anymore? Well, we'll have games which are simulated struggle and such. That was a good point, Lux.
Thanks for putting my point more eloquently.
Do games kind of seem less valuable if they're just like a simulated version of something like they're just like a fake copy of the thing that's actually there?
I don't know. Is Minecraft less valuable than, I don't know, Hades? Because Minecraft is more, it's closer to real life?
I think the point is that games aren't really simulations. So, like, all of what Lux and Joey were saying was like, they were going on in detail about this idea that's very interesting. But they were also saying it's like in you don't build your house anymore, but you build your house in Minecraft or Terraria or something, and that's how you connect with this skill or this aspect of life that is like building your house. And it's incorrect to say that it's a mere simulation to build your house in Minecraft, because you are building your character's house, building the structure, putting your bed. So it's maybe misleading to say that it's a simulation, because like what's it simulating? It's like, you could say it's like simulating real life. Well, Minecraft isn't a very accurate simulation of real life. There's no creepers running around. So you could say it's a simulation in that it's similar to an activity, to a very different kind of activity that you would be doing, like say if you had to build your house. But it's not a simulation because you're actively doing it, and this is one of the advantages of games, is that when we play Agricola, we actively build our manor, basically, using resources. We don't just simulate building a manor, we are building a manor, but it's in the game.
Yeah, something that Eric was saying about, in Minecraft you're building, your player's house and such. When you're building a house in real life, I think that if you were to, T would say that a game such as Minecraft draws the essence of that, all of those activities, and you get Minecraft, right? But in real life, surrounded by this core activity, there's so many variables that make up the experience of building a house. This is why I asked the question about how T and agency as art balances this. Games are good because they simplify, but also they're bad in other cases because they simplify. Is because it seems like this should be an aspect of games which, according to T's own terms, would fight back against the idea that games are good for this practical experience, because the thing that would be valuable in building a house is all of these variables that you have no control over and that aren't simplified. All of it together are what make up the value of building a house. I'm not sure exactly where I'm going with that, but my point is there seems to be a tension between saying that practical experience is beautiful, but then the sum whole of experience with all of these confounding variables is also beautiful as well, because because they're not simplified.
So one thing is I don't think games necessarily have to make things simpler, or to kind of go with this point. It's just that it makes so that the activities you're doing are more concentrated. It's as an example, I could play the game Angry Cat in the car while driving somewhere. Driving somewhere is simpler than driving somewhere while there's an angry cat in the car. But it's the angry cat in the car is more of more of a crystallization of dealing with a distraction while you're driving. So there's a game idea for you fellas.
I think I disagree with you on that, Will. I think games kind of do have to be simpler than their real life counterparts, because take the example of building a house. I think it's I think it's much, much simpler to build a house in Minecraft than to build a house in real life. If it weren't, people just wouldn't do it.
So this is a thing. If you just limit yourself to video games, and this is how this works. But if you're if you're talking about games such as Angry Cat in the car, you have all the physics of real life and biology of angry cats combined. So that there isn't a simplification, and that is a game that could exist. Someone could do that if they don't care about the law.
And I do recognize that I'm approaching Wen's book a lot from the perspective of video games, mainly because that's what I'm used to, but also because he doesn't really go into much depth. And I also remember your point that not all video games are Wen's concern in this book. It's only striving play, achievement play, and not all video games are about that.
Yeah. So as an example, if you're playing Minecraft, a lot of times you don't give a shit about beating the Ender Dragons, so it's not really striving play most of the time.
My turn. So I think all this talk of simplification is rather misleading. I think when you're talking about comparing building a house in real life to building a house in Minecraft, you shouldn't be comparing these things because they're so different. So one is not a simplified version of the other. Simplification and simpleness implies simplification implies an analogy. and there is no analogy, but you are building your house. So you can't build your house anymore. You don't build your house anymore. So what do you do instead? You build your house in Minecraft. Well, you're building your house either in real life or in Minecraft, but building your house in Minecraft is not a simplified version of building your house in real life, because that implies an analogy that is not present. And an analogy is just an identifiable similarity.
Well, that may be. And by the way, that sounds is that like Wittgensteinian or something? Because that sounds really like it. But
Yes.
just like I'm working with like Thi's own terms of where he's saying like practical activity. It kind of does seem like that. Like using the example between building a house and Minecraft. Like Minecraft would be a simpler theme because you're drawing the essence of the activity of building a house. Yeah.
Or you could say there's no essence of the activity. There's just no essence, Or
I'm a fan of that.
Whatever essence there is there's two different essences. There's the essence of building the house in real life, and there's the essence of building the house in Minecraft. I mean, either way, you're building your house, right? You're making a structure. You're putting your bed in it. You're putting your chest full of meat in it, and you're doing that in real life. If you were to do that in real life, and you're doing that, but ultimately these are two different activities, and we can describe them using similar words, and that's where our satisfaction comes in. But you're talking about two radically different activities, and there's no benefit to saying one is a simplified version of the other.
Yeah, and maybe the angle you'd want to take it more is that it's like just about struggle and conflict, and that's kind of what's not as like that's kind of the bare essence of just any game, is that there has to be that. I think that's why he outlines the striving play to begin with, and then where he's saying that, in a time when we seem to be removing a lot of struggle from our lives, but struggle is still something that we like aesthetically seek pleasure in, so this is a way that we could achieve it. So the analogy isn't necessarily building a house in the same way, but it's just that there's a struggle that is involved with that we want to have in our lives to some extent.
I think it's also like rather actually somewhat far-reaching, because a lot of what we do could fall under the category of Suitzian game, and so like because we're often doing something for some end, but once we like technologicalize everything and get rid of all that, then like we just have the ends, and so what's the we just sit and like stare at paintings that come across us, and we don't even have to go to look at paintings, because just an AI will algorithmically decide what painting is the best one to look at.
And sorry, I just have to bring this in, but this is the simulation machine. Remember when we were having that discussion in the chat? It's like, I don't know. That's just that seems somewhat distasteful. I don't know if that's like the end of where everything goes. I don't know.
This is the problem with Nguyen's book, is that he has this idea of control and simulation and all this, and it's not. And that's why it's unsatisfactory, is because we notice how we came around to this idea of simulation and decisions being made for you and all that. When the point of games is you're making your own decisions. You have to decide what to play and how to play, and that's where the art comes in, is your decisions and your striving.
Or maybe that's an illusion and you're constrained by the rules.
Well, that gets into like the metaphysics of like mind control. And simulation theory it's not even worth talking about, because it's just metaphysics, but it's using techno babble, technology babble, talking about simulations. It's just we're back to metaphysics, and we're back to why people say metaphysics doesn't make sense anyways. Is because, but why it does make sense is because we keep coming back to it. We keep talking about it.
Well, does anyone have like I say we can go around the room real quick and just say like our last impressions of what we got from the book, and what our kind of concluding thoughts are. But do you guys have anything else that you'd like to throw in before we conclude this episode?
So Thi makes use of this terminology. He talks about prescriptive ontology. So this is in the context of appreciating art. So prescriptive ontology, these are the ontic prescriptions. These are the real prescriptions, the real rules you have to follow to enjoy a piece of art. So if you're talking about like Western modern paintings, well, modern as in, say, 19th century, part of the prescriptive ontology is that you have to like stand a foot away and look at its front. And this is all pedantic when you're talking about more passive forms of art. But once you get into games, the issue of prescriptive ontology really matters, because the ontic prescriptions, the real rules, are in a rule book. And so this issue is big. That was one other nice thing about this book, is that he points out that the rules for appreciating, there are many more explicit rules for appreciating when you're talking about games, and this is a unique aspect of games. So if you're a philosopher who's wondering about issues relating to games and whether games are art and how do we appreciate games, this is a good book for you, because he does get into the weeds, and then he makes it nice and intuitive. So that's my final thoughts. This is a good book for philosophers. He makes effective use of terminology, compares art to other forms of. He compares games to other forms of art, and it does. I wound up answering my own question of like, is Super Mario World art? And the answer is yes, because I can play it pretty good, and that's my takeaway. And now I'm done.
I think my takeaway is just that I think the book offers a lot of interesting like conception, like models to thinking and approaching both aesthetics and epistemology that I think are very worthwhile for a philosopher. I'm not a game designer, so I don't know. I'm not going to speak of what they take away from it. But I think it just allows me to think of certain real phenomena that seems to happen in our lives in a way that I'm not sure is more correct, but is at least more interesting.
I do actually design games sometimes. Eric was talking about like it might be a problem for game designers because they'll think of themselves as some like godlike entity, manipulating the actions of the players, and that might be a bit of a problem. But as you do actually have to kind of think about where you're steering the players and what you're doing, because you don't want the players to be doing a bunch of boring stuff because it's the most effective way to complete the goal. You got to make sure that the most effective way to complete the goal is a way that isn't really boring. The other thing I think is one other thing I like the motivational inversion thing, or like you're taking on the ends for the means. It's that's interesting, and I think it makes it so that a lot more activities can be worthwhile and not just all be worthless, other than like eating brownies. That's the only thing that's worthwhile.
All right, mine is actually a question for those of you that have read the book. I was looking through my notes from 4 years ago at this point from one of his classes, and back then T had the thought that team sports are a way for people to dump their homicidal impulses. Do you think that he still kept those sentiments about sports?
Huh?
Yes, I think he did, because he does go into sports. How would I match that to what he does in the book? He goes. So the temporary agency is the homicidal tendencies. So that would be a temporary agency.
I know of an example he used. So he talked about how like you can transform activities from things that are bad to things that are good. So boxing is an example he uses. It's like, beating the shit out of each other. Generally we see that as bad in a normal context, but in boxing, it's a good thing for people to be beating the shit out of each other.
Okay, but in all seriousness, this was a really good podcast, and I'm glad that I was able to join you guys. And I think that this book has a lot of connections to the things, especially his views on technology, that he had before writing it. And it's been really interesting to see those connections and make them.
So I have two final thoughts. One of them is in connection to what Eric just talked about, prescriptive ontologies. He Nguyen gave the example of Moby Dick, that if you want to read Moby Dick, you need to read all the words in a row together. So
And in order.
and in order, yeah, that's very important. So I think my takeaway from the book is that in practical reasoning, there is nothing necessary by itself, the way in which in logic there are things necessary by themselves. So for example, in logic, all tautologies are necessarily true. But when it comes to practical reasoning, when you have to decide what you do in the world, there is nothing necessary about that. You choose the challenges and you choose the obstacles. So in a way, games have unnecessary obstacles. Maybe practical reasoning is also about the unnecessary obstacles we choose by ourselves. And another thought would be, I didn't read part 2, so I don't know if he discusses this in part 2. I would like some explanation as to what makes what makes a way to play a game beautiful and what makes a move beautiful in a game. So I don't know if he talks about that. I would like someone or something that expands on that.
He has a few. So he has harmony of solution, which is where you choose a solution that perfectly solves a problem. There's harmony of action, which is the person actually performing the solution in a great way. And then there's harmony of capacity, where someone's just barely able to achieve the goal. And those are like aesthetic.
Yeah, so that was mentioned in part 1, but then the question would be, what is this harmony and why is harmony beautiful? But I know these are not questions the book treats explicitly, so I think that's it for me.
There's a whole chapter about these harmonies. Actually, that's the selling point of the book, is that there's a whole chapter where he goes over these harmonies. And I think when anyone uses harmony anywhere, they're using an analogy to music. So if you're thinking about, like, whoa, why is this harmony beautiful? Well, think about how harmony is beautiful in music, and then that'll be a sufficient answer. That'll be a, relatively satisfying answer. It's like, I'm playing this game. It's like I'm making beautiful music full of harmonies, but it's an analogy. An analogy is just a specific similarity. Music is what literally has harmony, and you can think of other forms of art as possessing harmony by analogy, but that's where the beauty comes from, and he has a whole chapter about it.
And just my concluding remarks is that it's having had a class on Thi and just listening to what everybody has to say on him, it's been very interesting connecting just to see whether games are the source of it or whether it's just like a symptom of his entire thinking and such. But his entire ideas on systems and how they affect agents and, the possibility of being able to, of a gentle fluidity and such. But, I may disagree with him on several points, but, the way he writes the book, to try to, not being pedantic, trying to just get to what he's trying to get at. I don't know. I think that's pretty honest. Yeah. But anyway, I guess we'll close it here, guys. Thank you, everybody, for coming out, and we'll see you again. Catch you later.